Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and this is Power's Gold Label. And you can think of it as being kind of like Jameson, but a bit more. So let me get into the glass and I'll tell you a bit more about it. Now first off, why am I comparing this whiskey to Jameson? Well, there's a couple of reasons. So they're both produced in Ireland and they're both pitched as being a kind of a entry-level workhorse bottle. They're both around about the same price and they're both produced in Middleton in County Cork in Ireland. So since the 1970s, Powers as well as a few other whiskey brands have all been produced in the Middleton distillery down in County Cork, which means this whiskey is coming off the same stills as Jameson. And since it's also a blended whiskey being comprised of grain whiskey and pot still whiskey, the comparison is pretty easy to make. Grain whiskey is made in a column still and it's typically quite easy to produce, whereas pot still whiskey is the style of whiskey that's unique to Ireland. It uses malted and unmalted barley and typically gives you this rich, kind of dense, peppery, spicy flavour, as well as a nice kind of creamy, oily mouthfeel that really helps a pot still whiskey stand up. However, while the components of the blend might be the same, the way they're put together is different. So in Jameson, it's about 30% pot still whiskey and 70% grain whiskey, whereas for Powers Gold Label, it's about 30% grain whiskey and 70% pot still whiskey. So it's kind of a mirror image of each other. So it should have more of that spiciness, more of that characteristically Irish type of whiskey in it. In fact, for a long time in Ireland, Powers actually outsold Jameson, and there are still a good number of places in Ireland where Powers would be the go-to whiskey instead of Jameson because it's just got more of that kind of distinctly Irish character going on inside of it. The Gold Label is also a fairly easy drinking whiskey, coming in at 40% ABV and being matured exclusively in ex-bourbon barrels. It's not going to have a huge amount of heat, it's not going to have a huge amount of spice coming in, and with that ex-bourbon barrel finishing, it is just going to have a nice bit of sweetness to complement and to balance out those pot still peppery spicy notes you're going to get in this whiskey. So that's enough talking, let's go in for the nose on the Powers Gold Label. Okay, right off the bat, I'm getting kind of a orange citrus kind of note coming through. It's like the skin of an orange, and that's backed up by a nice bit of kind of creme brulee brown sugar, that kind of slightly burnt, slightly melted brown sugar, as well as a nice bit of vanilla, of course, as well as a bit of oak coming through. Not a huge amount of oak, not like a really strong note of oak coming through, but just like you can kind of smell the wood influence on the whiskey. As I go in, I'm getting more of the kind of grain sweetness coming forward. That little bit of grain whiskey is definitely having an influence. But with that brown sugar, with a little bit of cinnamon that's coming through, it's kind of like a shortbread biscuit where you get that grain sweetness, you get that kind of buttery vanilla, you get that richness, and you also get that sugary kind of note coming through. Yeah, it's quite like a biscuit being cooked, like a nice rich biscuit. And on the tail end of the nose, if you look for it, you can get a little bit of pepper, a little bit of white pepper. It's not a very strong note. I mean, it's quite a mild note. It is there, but it's definitely sitting behind that brown sugar, the vanilla, the orange citrus, and that kind of just general rich sweet note you're going to get here. So let's go in for the palate and see if that peppery note develops. Cheers. The palate is quite light up front, like the first moment it hits your tongue, it's quite light, but then it spreads out and you get this kind of honeyed mouthfeel, really nice and kind of dense, surprisingly dense for like a 40% whiskey. And then you get that bit of peppery spice coming through with the oak spice as well layered on. It does have a nice bit of kind of depth of spiciness behind it, which is what I would expect from the amount of pot still whiskey that came into this blend. But it's nice and rich. It's actually much less sweet, I think, on the palate than it was on the nose. Yeah, instead of like the brown sugar, that rich grain sweetness on the nose I was getting, I'm almost getting like a orchard fruits, apples and pears kind of note in terms of sweetness. So I'm gonna go in again and see if I can pick that out some more. Yeah, it's definitely milder sweetness on the palate. Definitely getting apples, pears, not really like a green apple, more like a red apple, that kind of lower sweetness, not like that sharp green apple note. It's more of a lower sweetness note. As well as I'm still getting a bit of that cinnamon, those kind of baking spices notes. That's definitely coming through on the palate. That was there in the nose. It's there in the palate as well. And as I sit with it, I'm getting a little bit of that oakiness that I got from the nose that's coming through again in the palate. So I think I'm going to take another sip. I'm going to talk about the finish. Cheers. Okay, on the finish, definitely that sweetness does start to fade pretty quickly. The honeyed mouthfeel, those apples and pears, they fade away pretty quickly, leaving me with the cinnamon, the oak, and those kind of peppery pastel spices. Definitely the spicy notes, the oaky notes, they hang on longer than the sweet notes in the finish. I mean, for a 40% whiskey, I wouldn't be expecting a massive kind of finish on this. I wouldn't be expecting a huge evolution. It is just a nice kind of a continuance of the notes from the nose and the palate into the finish. Ultimately, this is a nice whiskey. It is a workhorse whiskey. It's what I would call a workhorse whiskey. If you want a nice, simple sip of whiskey, you can go for Powers. If you want maybe a whiskey with a bit of spiciness that can stand up to like an Irish coffee or a hot whiskey or even like an old fashioned, this would be something that you definitely look for. It definitely has, I think, more character than some of the other entry-level basic blends on the market. It is just a nice workhorse bottle. Powers do have a couple of bottles in their range. They've got the 3 Swallows, they've got the Powers John's Lane, which are both definitely more upmarket, and they give you more of that pot still characteristic, more of the influence and more age in the whiskey. So if you like pot still whiskey, if you like kind of that typically Irish note, definitely consider Powers instead of Jameson, because it does give you more of that pot still spiciness. And then if you like what Powers are doing, check out the other bottles in their range. I mean, it's just a very good workhorse bottle. It's nothing to complain about, especially at the price they charge for it. So I'm going to keep on enjoying this. I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays and cocktail recipes on Fridays. So if you want to see more, make sure you hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time. It's launch it.